Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to welcome you all to this ACLS event on a very sunny and bright Monday afternoon in New York City. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm honored to serve as president of the American Council of Learned Societies, or as we affectionately call it, ACLS. It's wonderful to have you all here again in an event that is a highlight for us, and not only a highlight, but not a one-off. It's one of a series we began last fall. We're going to continue it next year, really to mark the depth of our passion and commitment to the issues, to the people you're going to hear from today. So again, thank you for coming. I want to say a word about, just very briefly, about why this event is so important to us before I kick off with a conversation with our first guest, Liz Fernández, and then we're going to open this up in about 20 minutes to a conversation involving faculty, serving faculty, as a panel roundtable discussion. But as I say, to set the stage for this event, I want to explain two reasons why it means so much to us at ACLS. Our mission is to support humanistic scholarship, the circulation of humanistic knowledge in the world and in the academy. That we define that as the humanities and interpretive social sciences. But we're, as we look at the landscape of the circulation of knowledge and in higher ed in particular, and this is the first purpose, we're especially interested in supporting PhDs who bring to humanistic study, research, and teaching and writing for all different kinds of audiences such intensity, such expertise, such passion. And we are committed to supporting humanities and social science PhDs inside the university classroom, should their careers take them in that direction, but also outside academia in the as defined by as college and university world, into K-12 education and beyond. Let me mention, as a quick aside to this, you would have seen, if you were paying close attention, a fairly quick slide in the intro run of slides that mentioned our Leading Edge Fellowship. This is generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and it's a fellowship that follows on the heels of our long time, over a decade long program called the Mellon Public Fellows. This places PhDs in the humanities in jobs outside the academy, outside of the higher education academy. Now Leading Edge places humanities PhDs in positions in nonprofits focused on advancing social justice and understanding in the world. So another example of our commitment at ACLS, which goes back well over a decade into concrete support for PhDs seeking to make their way in the world, seeking to make a mark in the world, as they do in all these positions. So that's the first reason. We want to offer concrete help and advice. And I think every single one of the speakers, looking at the panelists and having chatted with them for a few minutes before we began, you're going to get that from the next hour and a bit. But the second reason at ACLS we value these events so deeply is a structural reason. And it has to do with our concern and interest to foster deeper connections between K-12 education and universities and colleges. It's a divide. If you read any history of American higher education, it's a very peculiar divide. If you know anything about European or Middle Eastern or African or Latin American schools, and that's just a few examples of school systems that have closer connections between particularly high schools and colleges and universities. So there's no natural thing about it that American colleges and universities have built such typically high walls between themselves and high schools in particular, K-12 in general. And we are very much committed to breaking down those walls. And I should say, we're following in the path of a lot of people trying to do this good work. We're by no means alone, but it remains an issue that, as one high school teacher in a high school in Brooklyn told me a few years ago, he said, Joy, we send students from my school who want to major in the humanities or social sciences, we send them to you in the colleges and universities, but how interested are you? And this is when I was at a university. How interested are you in really talking to us? I would love to see this be more of a two-way street. I couldn't agree more. So this is really the future of humanistic education, the future of the circulation of humanistic knowledge, I think is closer ties between these groups. So that's just a taste of two of the reasons, as I said, we're so excited to welcome our panelists and welcome you, our audience here today. Let me start, as I said, by introducing our first guest speaker, who will set the stage for our faculty speakers with me. Liz Fernández joins us today from an amazing 25-year stint, I gather, from serving as administrator of the NYSAIS, and I think there's an easier way to say that she'll explain, for that job fair to promote diversity. It's a now virtual job fair that draws hundreds of prospective faculty and independent schools to it. Liz is also a senior consultant and leadership coach with Jones, a firm that consults in areas of diversity and inclusion and strategic change management and leadership development and organizational effectiveness, all things that are a lot easier to say in short phrases than make happen. So she's a real expert in these areas. She's written curricula, she's facilitated workshops across the globe focused on gender identity, cross-cultural competency, conflict management, and curriculum development for K-12 schools. And for many years before joining Jones this past summer, she served as the assistant head of school and ethics faculty member at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School. Liz has served on the faculty of the National Association of Independent Schools Student Leadership Diversity Conference for 8 years as co-chair. She's a board member and alumna of Bloomingdale Family Head Start programs, a preschool program supporting low-income families in New York City, and has a stellar, as you can imagine, a star-studded CV behind her, including starting out, I'll just say, a bachelor's in sociology and anthropology from Hamilton College. So I welcome Liz in joining me in the conversation to kick us off today. And I will just say one matter of housekeeping to the audience before we start, and that is that you should please enter questions using the Q&A function I was just checking to make sure I was going to say this right. It should be on close to the right-hand side of the bottom of your screen. This will let you not only enter your question, but you can look at the Q&A function and hit thumbs up, to vote questions up the queue as they come in. And that'll give us a chance to monitor the questions and put the questions in front of our panelists of most interest to all of you, our valued audience. So thank you for coming, and Liz, especially thank you to you for joining me to kick this off.
Oh, Joy, what a delight to be with you and with all the panelists here today. I'm really excited to share just a little bit of knowledge and really work and support the work of ACLS in trying to bridge the gap between higher ed and K-12 schools. As you mentioned, I actually went to school in Dominican Republic, which is where I'm originally from, for middle and part of high school. And words have never been truer in terms of describing the relationship in at least my own experience between higher ed and high schools. And it was much more of an intentional, supportive, ongoing conversation between higher ed and my high school teachers. And that definitely changed when I transferred my senior year of high school back to New York City. That definitely changed. So like you all, I'm definitely committed in demystifying the opportunities, in embracing them, and making sure that everyone who is interested in really the mission of ACLS and sort of some of those goals to really explore what does it mean to serve as an exceptional educator working with young people K through 12 in our schools.
Thank you. And I know I'm not alone. And in fact, I would venture to guess it's a characteristic of most people who go in to get a PhD, that they've been inspired by the idea of academic research and study, not just from their college professors or from some great experience in a class, their sophomore year in college, but going back, into grammar school, into junior high, into high school, that there's been 1, 2, maybe 10 teachers who left their mark and who shaped their lives. So certainly true for me. So let me ask you, because I think I really butchered the name of the job fair. I think there's an easier way to say it than my stumbling way of saying it. Can you correct me and then talk a little bit about the words there, and especially maybe the word, independent schools, kind of talk about that world and how you define it, how it's viewed. But please start by correcting me.
Absolutely. And no worries. So the New York State Association of Independent Schools, or what we affectionately call NYSAIS, is the state association that both provides accreditation to the independent schools, of which there are 199 in the state of New York. The concentration of those are going to be in New York City with Long Island and Westchester County. And then there's a concentration of schools in Buffalo and in Rochester and in the Albany region. And then there's a sprinkle sort of throughout New York State, but by and large, the concentration is in New York City. I have been affiliated with NYSAs since 2000, but I will go back a little bit further because in 1994, when I completed my first master's degree, I came to the job fair really uncertain about what my future profession would look like. I was thinking that I would go in one direction, and that didn't come to fruition as quickly as I thought. And so I came to this job fair because I had experience in event planning and in admissions work and in development work, and thought this is a great opportunity for me to explore maybe 1 or 2 years. As a result of attending in 1994, I did secure a position at a school. And the purpose of the job fair in the early 90s, and it's going to be really interesting to now fast forward because this is our 33rd year. At the time, there was a very clear desire to increase the number of teachers and administrators of color within independent schools to be in greater alignment with the city of New York in particular. It was initially a New York City gathering, and there were about 40 schools. Today, it's a statewide association event hosting over 100 schools. And we have schools that come not just from New York State, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Delaware, and the DC, Virginia area have all come to the fair and recruited. So I'm really proud of the work that NYSAs has done in sponsoring this job fair that welcomes everybody. There's a very clear intention to increase the number of teachers of color within our schools. And we also recognize that this is a wonderful opportunity for people who are passionate about teaching and learning, and in particular about creating inclusive spaces in school through curriculum, through leadership, through activities, through coaching, to be able to support young people of all ages and to partner with colleagues. So 33 years, and I have led the work for the last 22 of those 33 years.
That's amazing. Thank you. And good to put that in context. When you look across the landscape, which, as you say, has expanded well beyond, New York State, and so you're looking at a big palette. Talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing in this landscape. What are you hearing from schools when it comes to curricular needs or conversations in schools, cultural shifts, areas of growth?
Oh, absolutely. Well, besides the obvious, and let's just name it so that we can say the challenges of COVID-19 and every variant. This is the moment where educators, educational leaders are just the level of exhaustion is real. So I want to own that. I want to say that. I want to honor the sacrifices that our colleagues are doing in all learning communities. Beyond that, I want to really speak to some of the curricular trends that I've been hearing about that are actually, I think, really exciting. And it's really about seizing the opportunity, and the opportunity that this moment is providing individuals to think about innovation and integration, collaboration across disciplines, helping to engage students, to help them make connections and inspire a love of learning, to be really flexible between the in-person learning, always keeping the 6 feet of distance. There are lots of other creative ways to be able to inspire young people to really be passionate about what they're learning about, and to think beyond you can sit and talk in a pair share. Well, if you're sitting and needing to stay 6 feet apart, that needs to look a little bit differently. So what role is technology playing in that? Many of our young people are using social media as one of the primary ways in which they are connecting with each other. They're also using video games, quite frankly, as ways to connect. And I have seen different schools. I'm an independent school parent in addition to being an alum, and my son's school in particular is using different kinds of video game platforms to integrate an understanding of the curriculum that the students are using and doing project-based learning using Minecraft, among other kinds of platforms. And it's really been a very interesting experience. What I think ultimately is happening is that educators are being really responsive to the moment of uncertainty by meeting students where they are and using some of the creativity and innovation that students are asking for and demonstrating to educators. It's also requiring educators to really try some new things, which I think is really kind of fun, because if we really want to be lifelong learners, we get to model that for our students. I think there's been some cultural shifts as well. There have been some shifts around higher number of retirements. That shouldn't be a surprise. We know that the baby boomer generation in particular has been a generation that has been nearing retirement age, and that's been something that we've predicted. We noticed that the global health pandemic has created opportunities for schools to really think about the allocation of resources, to really think about the ways in which they're making decisions, the ways in which they're partnering even more with parents and with the leadership, the governance team in the form of board of trustees, to really be much more intentional about the decisions that they're making and to be able to be responsive to the ever-changing landscape we're all living through in this moment. I think there have been some really interesting pedagogical conversations about equity and inclusion in our schools, because the corollary to the global health pandemic has been the spotlight that's been placed on systemic inequities, and in particular systemic racism with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others, quite frankly, too many to name. And I think schools, and particularly trustees and leadership, and I would hope that parents and students and faculty are all having simultaneous conversations around mission alignment, stated intentions, the aspirational nature of our missions, and the vision for schools and the values and the ways in which our curriculum and our decisions reflect the values of our school.
It is exciting. And their conversations, I think, take on a special energy when we remember the age of the students, that you're talking about personalities and characters, in a state of formation. Of course, we're all changing, as you just said. We grow, and we hope continue learning as we grow older. But there's a real intensity, to the changes that happen in the years kind of up to 20 years old that I hear reflected in your words. Just maybe one more question before we turn to our and bring in our faculty panelists. Can you say a little bit, and this will set up the conversation, I think, really well with them, how many members of our audience I suspect are either PhDs themselves or they're advising PhDs who are thinking about getting into this exciting line of work. So can you say something about how, particularly about how somebody who's spent 3 or 4 or 5 years, focused on a particular area, the dissertation, everything connected to it, what steps are they best advised to take to prepare themselves for engaging in the values conversation and curricular work, and across a broad array of themes and topics and fields, very different from the kind of preparation they've had probably in their doctoral experience?
One of the things that excites me about this opportunity is that we're talking to an audience of incredibly passionate people who have dedicated so much time, who have been engaged in scholarship around an area that is passionate for them, that it's a place where there's a real level of desire to learn as much as possible, a deep intensity. As an independent school educator, as a leader, nothing excites me more than people who are so passionate about a particular area of content that they are interested in then considering the profession of being an educator. I think the shift, and this is what I invite people to think about, it's a paradigm shift. If your thoughts were that you would live in academia, in higher ed, that's not the only place that you can have an exceptional impact. And in fact, I would advocate, obviously, that the greatest impact you can actually have is during more of those formative years between K through 12 education, when young people are formulating their thoughts and making connections with the houses of worship and the teachings that they've been exposed to, and the family learnings and the media and the books that they've read, and all those different influential texts and experiences. And you have a fantastic opportunity to take all of that and to really serve as a facilitator to ask questions and guide students to ask themselves those questions, ask one another those questions, and then begin to really interrogate their learning experience. What do they know? What do they still need to know? What are they curious about? How do they become critical and analytical thinkers? And for someone with an advanced degree who is passionate about a particular area, to be able to guide that process in a paradigm shift to think, this is where I am meant to be at this moment. This is the impact that I can have with this community of young people, and to share with them a love of learning and a curiosity. That to me is really exciting. I think you'll also be pleasantly surprised and encouraged by the level of scholarship and interest and opportunities for collaboration with colleagues who are just as excited about tapping into your experience and your focus and your course of study, and make a connection between that and something else. And it's not just within departments, it's across departments. It's not just within grades or grade levels or divisions. It can be across divisions and across grade levels. So there's lots of opportunity for innovation and collaboration that's just waiting to be tapped. And I welcome the opportunity to answer additional questions. And I look forward to hearing from the panelists who are living the experience and who have made the transition and are excited about sharing their connections with our audience.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I have to say, I don't want to worry my colleagues at ACLS, but you're making teaching K through 12 sound like the right career for everybody. So thank you so much. I want to open up the conversation to the rest of our panelists, and we're going to start out once we can all see them on the screen. We're going to start out with a quick introductions of them. They're going to introduce themselves. I think I will do call out people's names, if that's all right, on my Zoom screen order, so you can just take it from there. So Susan, and then Juan, and then Katie, and then Tinia. If you could introduce yourself, and welcome, and thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy lives to join us today at ACLS. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy. My name is Susan Bree. My PhD is in French, and right after getting my PhD, I actually did spend 2 years teaching at a university as a visiting assistant professor at William and Mary in Virginia. After that, I moved back to New York, and I got a job in a public high school in suburban New York, so in Westchester County, and I have been teaching there very happily for 22 years. I'm a classroom teacher of world language, both French and Spanish, and I should say as well that part of my extracurricular responsibilities are traveling with students as part of an annual exchange program with a high school in France. So those are my experiences and my roles.
Hello, I'm Juan Carlos Aguirre. I use he pronouns. I graduated with a PhD in comparative literature from NYU. And I guess my trajectory was that it's a little bit complicated. Now I teach at the high school level. I'm an English teacher, so you can ignore the French posters in the background. I'm just in a classroom, but I teach English 9th, 10th, 11th grades. I've been doing it for about 3 years, full time now. I did have a teaching postdoc at NYU after my dissertation defense, and I was adjuncting for a while. This is actually my second stint in K through 12 teaching. So prior to, while I was finishing my PhD, I also did a part-time year where I didn't really have funding. So I was able to apply for a part-time teaching position at the same independent school where I am now, the Collegiate school. And I guess anything, oh, and this is a boys' school. So there's like a whole other layer to the shift from higher ed.
Okay, great. Excuse me, I think I was up next. My name is Katie Holt. I currently work at the Emma Willard School, which is on display in my Zoom background. It's up in Troy, New York. So it's an independent school that's in that cluster Liz mentioned in the Albany area, the Capital District. It is a boarding school. 60% of our students board, so I'm happy to answer questions about that kind of work. It's also historically all girls. We're moving away from calling ourselves fully an all girls school because we're open to more kinds of gender expression now than we might have been in the past. But my PhD originally was in Slavic languages and literature. So Russian literature was my field. And I finished my PhD at Columbia and taught for a few years at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And when it became clear that I wasn't ready to build my entire life as an expat, returned to the New York area. And I, like Juan Carlos did, the first year I did some part-time teaching, both at the high school level and the secondary level, well, at BPI, the Bard Prison Initiative. So I was sort of testing lots of different kinds of teaching and then wound up here. And I initially taught in the English and history departments, and now I'm primarily in history. I'm the history department chair here. So there are a lot of things I could say about the kind of best parts of teaching at this level. But one thing I'll say, when I made this shift, I was told, well, high school teaching is for people who like to teach students, and college teaching is for people who like to teach content. And I can say for sure that this is a false dichotomy, but that I've really enjoyed at the high school level, the sense that I am genuinely really getting to know the students and teaching them as individuals at the same time that I can still have quite high level conversations with them. So maybe I can assign less reading for a given class session that I would have done at the undergraduate or graduate level, but the kinds of questions I can ask them are analogous to the questions I would ask of older students or more experienced students. And you can really get at some very deep problems. And also just to get to be sort of a generalist and to continue learning in many different fields is really wonderful about working at this level.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tania Merriweather, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm glad to be here. I heard a lot of overlaps with what my colleagues on the panel said, but my story is also a little bit different. So I've known I was going to be a teacher ever since I was in kindergarten. And when I was in kindergarten, I was picturing like an elementary school classroom. And that vision has morphed over the years, but I'm come to you now with 26 years of experience in the classroom. All of the years have been in independent schools, which was not part of the original plan. So the speed version from kindergarten to now is, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. So I went to Spelman College, which is a historically Black college and a women's college in Atlanta, Georgia, majoring in elementary education. At Spelman, you can't just major in education, you have to have a degree in something else. And so I was like, but I just want to teach. But I was forced to also get a bachelor's degree in child development, which is what planted the seed. And I now have a PhD in applied developmental psychology. I finished that at Fordham University 4 years ago. And in between there, I also have a master's from Teachers College Columbia in educational psychology, which is what brought me to New York. And so I was always just going to be an elementary school teacher. That was what the vision was. When I was at Columbia, I got recruited so at Spelman in my student teaching, I taught at the time, Georgia was ranked 49th out of the 50 states in public teaching. Atlanta apparently had the worst schools in Georgia, and the elementary school I was assigned to had like the lowest performing rankings in that time. And then fast forward to my first real job, which was Friends Academy in Long Island, New York. So you could not get more different than that. But at Spelman, I discovered that like I wanted to, you know, make a difference. And there's a lot of different ways to make a difference, particularly showing up as a teacher of color. There's a great need everywhere. And so when I was at Columbia, I got recruited to the Independent Teaching Project, which is no longer there. And I was like, send me to your worst schools. I want to be in, you know, inner city, New York City. But then I found a need for my voice and my presence in independent schools. Started in elementary school, then moved to middle school, which is also my teaching passion currently. And then when I got the job, what I currently had at Ethical Culture Fieldston School, I started teaching middle and high school. And then now I've taught elementary, middle, high, undergrad, and grad. And I currently also teach in the grad program in NYU Steinhardt. And there's a lot of similarities which we can get to between, I actually think middle school and grad school are very, very similar. And they're my two favorites. And then I would rank elementary, high school. But there's really wonderful things about every age level. There are times when I have conversations with my 7th graders that I'm like, I wish my grad students could get there. You know, and there are differences, but there's definitely a need at every level. And I think there's different challenges and different rewards at every level. So I'm happy to talk more about that.
Thank you all so much. And thank you for sharing, you know, shining a light, I think, on your trajectories, on your paths, because that itself, I think, gives especially those people in the audience and, you know, currently pursuing their PhDs or recently finished, just, you know, models to think with. And you know, as I said at the beginning, there aren't enough of them in the regular practice of doctoral education. So thank you for sharing that and setting us up that way. Let me say two things about the conversation to come. The presence of you, our audience members, your questions, your concerns, and your curiosities, we really want to put those center forward. So we encourage you to put questions in the chat. Excuse me, not in the chat, in the Q&A. Please use that function. To get us started while you're thinking about your questions, what you really want to hear our panelists talk about, and panelists, I include Liz too. Let me go back first, the question I started exploring with Liz about how best somebody, you know, people in our audience could prepare themselves for K-12 teaching, having dug into a particular area for some years. And feel free to be granular. I mean, one thing we learned from our first webinar on this topic is that audience members really want to hear specifics. So you know, what can people expect? Anecdotes of things that really shine a light on your experience. We really want to hear them. But advice about how people can prepare for, as Katie said, the more generalist, and as Tinia said, the many ages out in front of a new teacher or someone thinking about entering this space as a doctoral student.
I think I would echo something that Liz said, which was that you want to be kind of clear on this kind of new role that you're going to be taking on. So for many, many years, you've been a student and you have dedicated all your energy to learning and becoming a specialist and sort of, you know, honing your passion for something. And now your role is now going to change. Not that you're not going to continue to grow and explore your passions, but you need to think about how you can turn that energy and that passion to your students and get them excited about whatever you're passionate about, but help them explore their passions and help them, if they have something really that they're really excited about, sort of show them the way to develop that passion. Teach them the skills that they need to be students, to be academics, perhaps, but maybe not, perhaps to be just simply to be lifelong learners. So it's, in a sense, you have to think about the path that you've taken, and then you want to help to develop those skills in your students. I think that's probably the most important thing. It's almost like you're switching lenses completely, and you're taking what you've done and you're trying to show the students how they can do something similar.
If I could just jump in, Susan, I something that you said really struck me. that you were saying about sort of the mindset needs to shift. One thing that I noticed for me is that I had to let go of certain ideas of ideas that I had about what it meant to be a learner, about what it meant to be a scholar, and kind of just realizing that you don't have to stop. You're not leaving learning just because you're leaving higher ed. You're not leaving learning. And I think that that was a really sort of powerful realization for me. And also just really empowering, because I kind of had this realization that, wow, I don't need a specific kind of institution to be the place where I learn and the place where I develop myself as a scholar and as a thinker. So that, I think, was really important for me, just mentally making that shift. And then I think being more open to relationships with your students, because I was always teaching at a research university. All my higher ed teaching was at NYU, and it's a huge university. It's an urban university. And so the style was very much, the students are pretty detached from their professors generally. And so I had to kind of open up to this whole idea that, like, whoa, like students want to stay after class and talk to me, and they want to ask me questions about like myself and my interests and like my favorite books and movies. And that was a shift that I think needed some adjusting. And it was a really joyful shift. Just knowing that yeah, like younger students are more eager to build relationships. And just even the idea, I think as a graduate student, unfortunately, we're often infantilized, and where our work isn't recognized and our professionalism isn't recognized. And so it was actually great to come into a K-12 setting where none of that was true, where I didn't feel infantilized, where I felt that my professionalism was valued and fostered. So a lot of mental shifts, mostly for me.
I could quickly jump in on that as well. I want to sort of go back to the false dichotomy that Katie lifted up for us. And I agree that it's a false dichotomy. And I agree with what Susan was saying and what Juan was saying, that there is a need to shift in terms of how we focus on the learning process. And I actually think it is more challenging and takes us deeper, right? It's actually becomes another area of scholarship. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a developmental psychologist. And so studying the process of how young people develop is what I do. And I do study the school context. But I think for any educator, I think it's really important that we put it alongside our content. So that's, we're teaching the content and we're teaching the process. And that will take some work. And it's also not what many of us are trained to do in our PhD programs. Because I was already a teacher, like an elementary teacher and a middle school teacher before I started my PhD program, like I had a lot of practical experience to hang the theories that I was learning on. But like, I think one thing that we already have going for us, for those of us who are scholars, is that we are lifelong learners, right? So there's a lot that is written on building student-teacher relationships and why that matters. And I totally agree that sometimes younger students are like, they need those kinds of things. And particularly in independent schools, we are given the time and space to start to foster those types of relationships. So like one of my 9th graders emailed me like, so sorry about your Bengals, Dr. Merriweather, like the fact that they know like, oh, I'm from Cincinnati and this is my team, and they want to build that relationship. And another student was like, I really like the reading, and can we have more videos like that? Those kinds of things that show that they're really connected, and that also opens them up for you to dig deeper. So you're like, you like this reading, boy, do I have more reading for you. And there are definitely students who are going to be hungry for that. I also want to say that like, some of the skills that students need are really the same. Like there's sometimes that I get an email from one of my grad students, like, and an email from one of my 7th graders. I'm like, why is everybody asking me for a deadline, like an extension, the day it's, some of those things, and it can speak to the quality of what their middle school experiences were like, or what their high school experiences were like, and whether or not they were taught to self-advocate. But like, some of it isn't that different. And in fact, it's really the same. And so I want to like sort of invite us to think of this as a different type of scholarship and to really be proud of it. Like, I know that sometimes the academy socializes you to think like tenure track job or bust, but like you could be really fulfilled in a different type of job and sidebar make more money. Like, yeah, and it's, you know, obviously it's not about that. I don't think any of us are going to be academics or teachers if like we were just chasing the bag, but I think we can chase the idea of having impact on the world around us and really make a difference at every level. And I think it's all valued.
I think if it's all right, we can move to a couple of questions about the that kind of get into the how, you know, and kind of how does this connect to me and how do I prepare in a more detailed way. So a couple of questions about how somebody with a PhD in a field that's either viewed as publicly as very esoteric, that doesn't translate very easily into high school. How does such a person make their case to a hiring committee? What are the obstacles that might stand in their way? Maybe there aren't as many as we think. And also, very closely related question: how do people persuade hiring committees that they're ready to teach across fields? So it's kind of twist on the first question. And I'll open that up to everyone.
If I,
Katie,
maybe I could jump in. Yeah, I was just thinking, well, so my PhD was in Russian literature, and then I started teaching English and history. Okay, so how might one do something like that? Go from one kind of the humanities, let's say, to another discipline. I think it doesn't, to me, I mean, I can't speak for every prospective employer, but I think if you're able to explain the process you arrived at or how you learned to teach, regardless of what the content you were teaching was, rather than, I mean, and you can explain the process and what you've been engaged with at the level of classroom teaching, and also potentially any emotional labor that you've had to do in, because I think that's a real part of K-12 education. It's not just the classroom teaching, it's being an advisor maybe, or potentially being a coach, or being someone who travels with others, or advising a club, or just being available for check-ins through the day in the dining hall or something. It's things that you just wouldn't think about at the university level. If you can speak to how you've been a sort of a community member, and also what you've learned about teaching in whatever program or employment you've had up to that point, I think that's huge. I mean, for me, I will say I also went through research university, and everything in the culture that I was involved in was, how do you get out of teaching? How do you get a fellowship to not teach? How do you, it was all about the research. And I didn't teach that much while getting my PhD. And I look back and I wish I'd pursued those opportunities. So if you think at all, you might want to do K-12 teaching as a possible career, like, try to explore whatever teaching opportunities you can while you're still a PhD student. I would suggest, even if it means maybe takes slightly longer, if you can afford it, I think it'll make your sort of portfolio or your CV richer. I didn't have that much teaching experience when I was trying to transition. So I think that 1 year of doing some part-time teaching really helped me persuade people that I was serious about wanting to make the jump. But yeah, I think like I would talk to other teachers and I wouldn't even know what they're talking about with like modeling or different, like, I don't know, they would use education vocabulary. I was like, I don't even know what that is, because I would just show up and teach my Russian literature seminars and not have to think about it. So yeah, I think trying to show that you're conversant in teaching strategies and pedagogy in general will really help, even if the specific content of the lessons would have to shift once you moved from one field to another.
I would make the argument that no matter what content area you're doing your PhD, you are moving probably from a very esoteric topic to being a generalist. So even though I teach nominally in the same field that I have my PhD in, I'm certainly not teaching my students exactly what I did my PhD in. My PhD is in a very specific area of literature that my students would not even be able to really access in the native language. So, I mean, we're all becoming generalists when we move down to deal with younger students. So I would say to I would echo some of what Katie was saying. You do want to think about any experiences that you've had. Well, first of all, you've all been students yourselves for many, many years. And so you want to talk about the learning experiences that teachers have had on you, ways that you were able to get around difficulties as a student, and how you would apply that to other students. I think it behooves you to kind of indicate that you understand that not all students are like you. And so if you're able to discuss ways in which you've taught things differently to different groups of students. I know that a common interview question, at least in public schools, is often, if you've had teaching experience, they'll ask you, can you think about a lesson that really went badly? And what did you do? How did you react? You know, how did you change the lesson either while you were teaching or when you came back to it? How did you address the problem that you had? You know, how did you how you kept trying to reach the students? So I think that any experiences that you have, and it almost doesn't matter the age. I would argue if you teach undergraduates that those experiences are valuable, that those are valuable teaching experiences. Even I think Katie mentioned, if you have other experiences working with young people as a counselor, as a mentor, all of that is really valuable. And you should bring it up and talk about how you've made, you know, what ways you tried to connect to young people and continue to try to, you know, sort of to engage with them. I think that's really important. And I do agree, I would echo as well, that it is important. I too kind of stumbled into high school teaching, and I was highly unprepared to deal with some of the language of K-12, which changes, evolves over time. But I definitely think it's worth investing a little bit of time to looking into sort of current theories. Like transdisciplinary is very big, so to sort of look around and see what kinds of transdisciplinary work is being done, what kind of you know, what kind of jargon people are using, what it means, because it all exists in university as well. It just maybe have different names for it, and it is very helpful to be a little bit conversant with those terms in case they come up while you're doing your interview process.
I wanted to jump in here because I mentioned earlier, it was not my intention to go into teaching. And in fact, I didn't take very many education courses in my undergraduate experience. And you want to talk about general and broad, I was an anthropology, sociology double major. And my first master's degree is in the sociology of education. So my interests were not necessarily to apply to education. I wanted to go into law in particular, in the criminal justice or criminal injustice system. And that was the direction that I thought I was heading in. I ended up at this job fair looking at independent schools and was appointed to a position that was about the skills that I had, as I mentioned, around admissions and event planning and coordinating activities and raising money. And one day I had to cover a class. And the class that I ended up covering was in the ethics department. And there was real transferability between what I had studied for my undergrad and first master's degree and what these students were learning about and exploring. And it really was pretty magical. The other thing I want to say is that independent schools in particular are institutions that do not require certification from the educators that are working within the schools. That varies as you get into the lower grades. The first few years, that may be different. So you'd certainly need to check each school to determine what specifically are the requirements. But as far as certification in the middle and upper schools, it is rare that independent schools are specifically requiring certification. And for me, as I started to explore, so I don't have to go back to pursue certification to explore being in the classroom more often, being in that magical space that I came so alive in just by virtue of having to cover for a colleague unexpectedly one day. I mean, truthfully, there are no accidents. I think I was meant to be there. And 27 years later, I have so appreciated all of the learning. I've also taught at the higher ed level as well. And like Tania, my passion is middle school and high school, much more so than the littles or in the undergraduates that I worked with. And that's partially because there's a level of energy, there's a level of excitement and enthusiasm, there's a raggediness with young people, particularly in those middle school years where they're having the best day of their life and the worst day of their life in the same 5 minutes. And sometimes that happens in high school as well. There's a little more posturing in high school, but it's just there's something fun and infectious. And if for those of you that have those degrees that you're wondering, how do they transfer? They're going to transfer because part of it is you're being creative and thinking about, maybe you took a course in a particular subject area. In my case, if I would have wanted to explore being a Spanish language teacher, Spanish is my first language, I could have pursued that. I would have taken a few courses. I would have wanted to make sure and respect the craft of teaching and understand how to teach a language as a second language to others, when for me it is my primary language or is my first language. So there are different ways to consider. But I certainly encourage you to think much more creatively when you read job descriptions. Look for some of those key words and descriptors that you're drawn to, that you have some experience and exposure with, and that you're interested in pursuing further.
I want to jump in quickly on this one to echo the part about reading educational thing. And so I grabbed my book. This is actually my favorite book right now. Came out maybe 3 years ago. Dr. Bettina Love's We Want to Do More Than Survive. So definitely read what the field is reading now. And so you have the language, and this also speaks to the larger why in the social justice movements we're in, and to be able to contextualize that. But the other piece is I wanted to say that using your research skills also works. So I remember strategic frame analysis, right? And that like some people are, social scientists, and they're writing, when I write to a policy audience, I do this. When I write to a practitioner audience, I do this. When I'm writing for journal editors, I'm doing this. So we already have the skills of translating what we do. And there's also a whole industry about like, how do you take a PhD and go to corporate America? So it's that same sort of translational ability, thinking about your skill sets. I read something on social media a couple weeks ago. There's a Facebook group called The Professor Is Out. Anyway, somebody was talking about having a PhD in history and how they became a real estate agent. And they're like now like one of the top real estate agents. And they took some of the skills that they had from that and thought about like, how does it apply in this field? So we can do the same things in thinking about how we take our creativity as researchers and thinkers and how I can apply it creatively in building a relationship with my students, of creating a classroom community, et cetera.
Thank you so much. I'm not surprised to see in the Q&A that there are a number of questions that are really practical, like what do you need? So could you speak, all of you or some of you, briefly to this question of documentation or certification? That would be really helpful, I know, to our audience members.
Just quickly, for my school, I didn't have to deal with any certification. So, I mean, they were actually pretty eager. The school's generally pretty eager to hire people with PhDs, generally, I have to say, regardless of the field, maybe not so in English. Maybe most people, I guess, most of the English teachers here have a degree in some kind of literature related field, but yeah, generally certification wasn't an issue.
Same here. I would say that, as far as I know, most of the New York independent schools for high school at least don't require certification. But just quickly on the practical question of sort of how you adapt your documents and what kind of documents are usually asked for. I've now done some hiring here as well, so I can say that usually it's a resume, a cover letter, maybe a transcript or two, usually at some point references. And I say resume intentionally instead of CV because I think it's helpful to take a moment and translate your CV into a resume. Ask for help if you need help. But I think if you submit a 10-page resume, a CV that has, every conference presentation you've ever done, you're sending the signal like you're still kind of speaking to the audience of higher ed. If you could maybe condense those presentations into, a few bullet points on a resume, I think it can sort of show that you're ready to switch audiences and you're aware of how your materials are going to be read. So, I had like an 8-page CV or something, put it down to like 2-page or 1-page resume, and, tried to explain that I would give more detail if there was ever curiosity. But so I would say being intentional about that is helpful. And then again, in that cover letter, making sure that you do all you can to signal that you're ready to use your research in new ways, or to do that process of translation, that you're open to, collaboration if you're worried that they're going to assume that you're too solitary in your research, that any practical experience you've had at working with new communities of students, or teaching different types of learners and so forth.
That's really helpful because that gets at another question. I wanted to make sure everyone paying attention to the questions noticed you were answering this one too, that it has to do with speaking to the question of, if you had to pick 1 or 2 things, if you're a busy PhD student, to build up your CV so that you're more competitive for these jobs. Katie, just in what you just said, I heard like the seeds of an answer that, keep an eye out for opportunities to teach different groups, participate in something related to pedagogy at your university. These are, typically, these can be offered at universities, and increasingly are, I think, and especially, go to your graduate dean's office or go to the provost's office and ask about opportunities to build up pedagogy, and to, sit in on some schools have not guest teaching, but you can sit in on various faculty members, lectures, or TA sessions to learn how different people teach. And that too, I think, can be packaged as something you did of your volition, that shows your interest, that isn't hugely time consuming and can pay off in a whole bunch of ways. Are there other kind of, if you had to pick one thing for a really busy PhD student to do to prepare, that you would identify for our audience?
I don't know that I'd say that there's one thing, but I would like to come back, since I think I might be the only representative from public school education. There is a certification process that you would have to go through, and it's depending on the state. So every state will have its own certifications. However, I did see in the Q&A that some people were talking about going from one state to another, et cetera. And usually, frequently, certifications are transferable from one state to another. So even if you don't have a certification in the state that you're desiring to teach in, or if you certify in one state and need to move to another, frequently there's a transfer process that that doesn't allow you, that doesn't mean you have to go through the entire process all over again. So I could speak to a New York certification process. As I say, I kind of stumbled into public school teaching. I was one of those people who didn't really know that I was going to end up where I ended up. And I was able to do much of my certification process while I was actually teaching. So there's no bar to being hired in a public school if you don't have a certification, particularly if you're a bit of a unicorn. That is to say, they need somebody in a specific role, and there are very few. I know that some science areas, there's a very high demand, and so they'll allow you to teach and pursue your certification at the same time. And I will say that I did that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. One question I want to turn to, a popular question about work-life balance. But before we get there, we also had a couple of questions just directly related to this about time of career transition. So a couple of people who are writing saying, "Well, I'm not a current or recent PhD. I've had significant experience teaching in higher ed. What about me? Can I make the transition?" Could you all speak to that? Are schools looking for "quote unquote" fresh PhDs of people in their 20s, or are the doors open more widely than that?
I would actually argue that the more teaching experience you have, the more desirable you would be. Having a PhD is a qualification, but schools are not looking for people who have cutting edge theory in academia. Schools are looking for people who are passionate about teaching and passionate about sharing their passions with young students, and who can do that effectively. So I think the vintage of your PhD is very much secondary.
Yeah, I have colleagues, and again, I'm at a school in New York, but I have colleagues who have come into the school, have worked here for years, having left, in some cases, tenured positions, in some cases, tenure track positions. So I definitely don't think that there's an expiration date on anyone's hiring prospects as a PhD.
Thanks very much. It's great to hear. Let's turn then to a popular question about work-life balance. Do you have any advice? The questioner wants to know on how to discuss concerns about it with prospective employees. So employers, sorry, very particular question, especially in a boarding school environment. How do you bring up this issue of where are the lines drawn between my life and the life of the school and engagement with students? So boarding school in particular, but more in general too, how would you describe the work-life balance in your position? And I'm sure it's in the questioner's mind by comparison to the higher ed work-life balance.
Okay, well, I think I'm the boarding school rep here, but other people can jump into more general work-life balance stuff. I would say that's a real question. There is positive dimensions. I have 2 children, which I volunteer to say I chose to work at a boarding school in part because I can raise them on the campus. They can go to in non-COVID times, they can go to the dining hall and eat and interact with older students. They can, play on the campus. And I feel very lucky. I get to live on the campus and walk to work. And there's wonderful things that come with it. The flip side is when school is in session, there are long breaks, but when school is in session, I'm on duty 1 night a week in the dormitory. I have coached a sport. I have often I'm getting emails in the evening from students, and you can try to draw boundaries and say, I don't respond to my email at night, but still they'll come in because they're in study hall. So it is something to make sure you are aware of, that there are a lot of demands on one's time at these kind of boarding schools, and that the exchanges that you get, long vacation and certain other benefits that I can talk about if people are curious. But I think just asking, I don't think you would be shut down if you just asked, or like, what are the expectations, or do all teachers get faculty housing, or is there a stipend if they live off campus? Asking just sort of about the benefits as you go along, so that you understand what might be involved. There's often someone in human resources, just as in higher ed. You might not want to ask all those questions the very first round interview, because you want to let the conversation develop, probably first about the teaching practices, and then later on think about the whole package. But it is a very intensive work environment, very rewarding, but very intensive. But again, as I said, then there's a lot of time during the longer breaks. One thing I would say, there's been a couple of questions about, do you continue to publish? I don't mean to take us into a different direction, but for me, I did stop publishing, and that was strange because I had been so research oriented. I don't want to say that, I don't know, maybe I'll go back to writing in some other genres later on besides academic articles. For me, it sort of became impossible to, research and publish, raise my kids and teach. So right now I'm raising my kids and teaching, and who knows what will happen later on. But I think for everybody, there's, that sort of juggling act. I'm sure in a different position, I might be continuing. And I don't know exactly how it would work without the institutional affiliation. So that is a real thing to think about. But potentially if you were adjuncting somewhere else at the same time, or keeping an institutional affiliation somewhere beyond your K-12 institution, that might be beneficial if you really wanted to continue to publish.
I can jump in quickly here. I think work-life balance is a challenge everywhere. And, you know, I think we probably know people in academia who manage to do it in 40, 50, 60 hours. Some people who work around the clock, right? I think the same thing happens. These schools are looking for, you know, dedicated people who really want to bring excellence and commitment to their craft to it, which doesn't mean that you have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, right? I'm saying this out loud because it's a thing I'm working on, but like, I am really trying to get back to my writing. I'm in the process of working on my book finally. And I have some articles going, but it's definitely not easy, but it's not like it's easy in other places too. I was working in the school, my whole PhD program. So like I did write my dissertation and work at the school. It took me many years to get done. I think when I was most productive, I wrote from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. and then went to work. But I don't want to do that anymore. But like I'm telling myself, like, you could get an hour in and then go to work. But I definitely have colleagues. There's several people with PhDs who work at Fieldston where I work, and several people who are still publishing, right? And there's some people who just write over the summers and then don't. So it can be done. I think it's, you know, it's just a trade-off. And because I also adjunct, I do have an institutional affiliation. But even these independent schools, a lot of times our library access, we can still get access to the same journals in many cases, or an interlibrary loan. And so particularly very well-resourced schools, you're not giving that up. And, you know, the New York Public Library, you know, is another thing that you could use if you were, for example, in a public school. But I'm not going to pretend it's not a challenge. Like it's a challenge, but if you had a tenure track position, it would be a challenge there too.
Let me just drop in, because this is, after all, the American Council of Learned Societies. A number of professional societies, learned societies, we've already had, well, Carlos, you mentioned the MLA and the resources it has online. I want to cheer on the executive directors and staffs at many learned societies in the humanities and social sciences. And you can look at ACLS, our list of member society, our list of member societies. You will see links there that will take you in many cases to resources, some for career transition of various kinds of from the higher ed classroom to other paths, but also support specifically directed at people who want to stay engaged in the scholarly community as it's defined by the discipline or field or area study. And it can be incredibly rewarding. I don't want to pretend, because I can hear a number of executive directors speaking in my ear. Different societies have different styles and different atmospheres, and it may be the case that the first society you may have signed up for as a doctoral student may not have the track record in supporting career diversity that you seek and that you need and that you deserve. But many do. So don't give up. And I would say the majority at this point have a lot of resources and very welcoming websites and staff that can answer your questions. But I also want to, save room. We're an evolving field. So I want to acknowledge that if you have one experience where you feel like your question about, how do I stay engaged as a 8th grade teacher in the discipline of X, if you don't get a good response from your learned society, keep looking, because there may be a closely related area where a lot of resources and help is available. So didn't mean to go on and on, but as I said, I wanted to cheer on the efforts of my learned society colleagues in this area. I did interrupt though, so I want to make sure, are there other questions about the work, or answers rather, to the work-life balance question before we move on to the job market? Shall I move there? Okay, so the popular question about the job market for aspiring public and/or independent school teachers: how competitive is it, especially compared to the tenure track humanities faculty job market in higher ed? What other kinds of related work might one pursue if one fails to get a full-time K-12 teaching job, especially jobs that would let you get into K-12 full-time down the road? So your sense of the job market.
So I would say it's what is it called? It's a buyer's market. Yeah, there's plenty, there's a lot, there's plentiful positions. So just to give an example, my institution right now, we're searching for an English department chair. And I don't know, I think we had about 50 resumes come in. So, I mean, it's a lot, but it's not a huge number, especially not for a school in New York City. So I think opportunities are really plentiful. I personally, the way I can say a little bit about how I got my foot in the door. My first stint at this school was as a part-time. I applied to replace somebody who was on maternity leave. So I was teaching like maybe 1.5 classes, because I had one class that was only one semester. But I applied for that and I was still doing my PhD. So I hadn't finished yet, but I did have some teaching. I did a lot of teaching during my PhD because that's how I got by. I kind of got a foot in the door there. After I finished my PhD, I had the opportunity to work as a substitute teacher at another independent school here in Manhattan. And I was doing history. I was subbing in the history department in middle school and upper school. So, I mean, there were opportunities here. There are some opportunities that are maybe going to be less selective, like substituting. And I think those are really good ways to get in the door and make some connections. Folks are really great. There's a lot of collegiality in independent schools. And I find that the relationships you build are really great. And often you hear about opportunities through other people that you've met.
I would echo pretty much everything that Juan Carlos said. I believe that there are quite a few positions out there. I know that COVID has taken quite a toll on the profession, and like everyone else, there has been a great resignation within the teaching field as well. That has left a lot of space for people who are feeling energetic and who are feeling excited. In the public school, I would actually discourage people perhaps from doing like the daily substitute thing, signing up to be a daily substitute, because I'm not really sure that you're going to get the kind of experience. It may be very different in an independent school, but in a public school, you won't really get much teaching experience. You'll certainly get contact with students, but it's a little bit more kind of babysitting. But I would recommend making contact with people in the kinds of schools that you're looking to work in. So if you're looking to work in independent schools, I would definitely contact independent schools in the areas. Let them know that you're interested in moving into that area. Make contacts, speak to people who are doing what you're hoping to do. You may find out that there are perhaps leave replacements that you could do, and a leave replacement is a really good way to get real teaching experience as a respected classroom teacher, as opposed to someone just coming in and covering for perhaps a myriad of teachers. Day substitutes in a public school, you'll be substituting an English class one period, and a French class the next period, and a math class the next period, and a gym class the next period. So I would argue that that's not quite so valuable an experience in a public school setting. However, doing a maternity leave replacement or a long-term leave replacement could be excellent experience, and it will allow you to make those same connections that Juan Carlos was speaking about.
I'd love to just throw in one more thing about the job market question in terms of the timelines. It's true that generally speaking, a lot of these schools, I'm speaking about the independent school market more than public schools. I'm afraid I know less about the public schools hiring, but there is a tendency for these positions to be posted in January, February, but there's a wide range of timing for this. So one possibility, this is how I dipped my toe by doing a leave replacement, like what others have talked about. Someone was running for Congress in a private school near me, and I took his history class for a year to see if I would like high school teaching. But the other thing I used to get a job was a placement agency that I don't know if I'm allowed to name them in particular, but anyway, I used one called Carney Sando, and it was free for me as someone who was wanting to transition into teaching to use this once they accepted me to represent. And then they would send me postings that might be a good fit for me, depending on how far I was willing to move, what kind of school I would like to work in. And it was incredibly helpful because often these schools only advertise for like a month, collect the resumes, and then hire based on who they have. It's a pretty truncated timeline when you compare it to higher ed. So using an agency, if you have any geographical flexibility, but even if you don't, potentially reaching out to one of those placement agencies might be a good option.
Thank you. I want to ask well, first, if people have other comments to add on that one. Okay, Tinia, go ahead.
I was just going to say that there's also agencies that specialize in educators of color. And so I'll see if I can drop the links to some of those. So those of you who are watching this who identify as people of color, I think there are like all schools, actually, independent schools, charter schools, and public schools are looking for us. And so there are different resources that way too. But Carney Sando is definitely a big one. And I know many of the schools use it. And have a lot of people who help. In fact, one of my former Fieldston students is currently like a placement agency person. And so like that might be a good one to get your foot in the door. And then there's also more specialized firms as well. And then also the job fair that Liz talked about before, I think that link is also in the chat. It would be a really wonderful place to start.
Thank you so much. And in the spirit of that, as we probably have time for, I think, probably 2 more questions. A popular question in the Q&A is very specific about the teaching demo. And I remember vividly being very anxious about my own teaching demo at the higher ed, in the higher ed job process, and would imagine that preparing to teach an age group I wasn't familiar with would be even more daunting. So specific advice on how to prepare for that?
Everyone should know that I've prepared, it's a pretty comprehensive document around what does it mean to teach in an independent school. And one of the areas that I focus on specifically is the teaching demo. I want everyone to really hear, whether you are doing a teaching demo in person or you're doing it through the Zoomiverse that we are all grown accustomed to. What is most important above everything, I have observed so many prospective teachers who are interested and who would be phenomenal in lots and lots of spaces, except they made one major mistake, which was to focus so much on getting through the lesson because they thought that what they were being assessed on was their ability to be able to do an arc of a lesson from beginning, middle, end with students. And instead, they missed the opportunity. You know, if Joy is a student in my class and I'm doing a demo, whether virtual or in person, something I said sparks a curiosity and joy, go for it. Make that connection with the students. Even if you don't get to the end, be self-reflective about what the next day would look like. That's the beauty of being a classroom teacher. There is always a next day, unless of course it's May or June, whenever your school year ends. And yet, you know, there's always an opportunity to say, I really want to come back to that, maybe tomorrow or maybe next week, or send a message. I mean, email. Yes, we all know that we get so many emails, but developing a passion between a student or a group of students and a faculty member is the joy. And in a demo, to be able to witness that moment as an observer, trying to assess whether that person will have a value add, someone who places value on connections with students rather than getting through something quickly because they're so task oriented that they miss that human connection, that's a missed opportunity.
I'll actually echo that. I just remember on one of the teaching demos that I did to get my job, a student said something that I didn't understand. And so I stopped my lesson and I looked at the student and I said, I've never heard that expression before. What are you talking about? It was something to do with their particular school. And all the students came to life and they were just falling all over themselves trying to explain to me what this was. And I never got to the end of my lesson, but the people who were watching the lesson said to me, that was an amazing teachable moment where, you know, your goal was language acquisition and those kids were just knocking themselves dead trying to explain to you in the best French they could come up with what they were talking about. And it made a big impression on the hiring committee. So I would say you really do have to remember that the goal is not necessarily the content that you're trying to get through. You're trying to make a connection with your students. If you make that connection with your students, you are going to communicate the content. But you don't need to worry about the content as your primary focus.
Yeah, just one more point on that. I think the energy that you bring to it, maybe moving around, getting up, just to send the signal you're not giving like a job talk or a lecture-based class, even if you're showing some slides or something, like showing that you're a dynamic presence in the classroom. And also a small tip that I got when I was interviewing for higher ed positions, but also served me when I was moving into K through 12. I would bring little sheets of paper to ask the students to make desk tents to like project their name and pronouns perhaps, and because it's very hard to remember everybody's name even if you do introductions, but if you have them facing toward you as an instructor, it's easier to call people by name, and building in a little time for those introductions to help, even if it's for 45 minutes, to have a classroom community to signal to the hiring committee that you would want to be building a classroom community if hired, I think can be beneficial instead of exactly just diving into the lesson and assuming it's all about getting through the quote unquote material.
Terrifically helpful. There's a question about shifting back to preparation about PhD versus master's education and whether that makes a significant, meaningful difference. The questioner says, I know I want to teach. Sometimes I wonder if finishing the PhD is actually worth it. Should I just try to jump in with the MA with the master's degree? Any thoughts on that?
I have one colleague comes to mind who also teaches English here at the high school level. He came in here ABD, and I think he still thinks about finishing, but I don't think he's in any hurry to. It seems there are a lot of people here with masters. I don't know how it works at other institutions, but here at least there isn't a big financial incentive to really like getting that PhD. In itself, right? I think the school wants to hire PhDs. Maybe there's a little bit of mindfulness toward the prestige that comes with it, but financially, I don't think that there's a big incentive, and I don't necessarily see it as a big hurdle for hiring.
I would say on the flip side, in public education, there is. I started with very little teaching experience, but on my salary scale, I started all the way at the left-hand side. So it made an enormous financial difference in terms of my starting salary. And in New York State, as a public school teacher, I believe a master's degree is the minimum requirement, technically. A lot of people do come in with a master's degree in education rather than in a specialized content area. But so everyone's got a master's degree pretty much in public school in some field or another. And so I would say for at least remunerative reasons, it's definitely worth hanging in there and getting that PhD if you're thinking about teaching in a public school.
Thanks very much. That's terrific. Very helpful. What about visas? This comes up at the higher education, in the higher education landscape all the time, as I know from my own administrative experience. And I have to say from that experience, it's a pretty unpredictable landscape. It's a mosaic. So some schools support visas without a sneeze, and others, it's really heavy weather. What is it like there? What is it like it out there in K through 12 education? Are schools willing to support international, the applications of international candidates who would require, say, an H-1B visa support sponsorship?
So I guess I can speak to that one again. I feel like I'm talking a lot here. But if you're a real unicorn, and there aren't a lot of candidates for your job, at least a public school will sponsor an H-1B visa for you. So our Mandarin teacher was sponsored for an H-1B visa, but that's about as far as it would go. You could perhaps expect to get help getting the visa but nothing beyond that. So I don't believe that there's been any conversation in terms of getting a green card. I don't think the school, it's very expensive. It can be prohibitively expensive, especially for a small public school with a small budget. But that being said, I definitely know that in my district, they were willing to sponsor an H-1B visa and continued support, so that a very specific candidate could come and teach.
Susan's absolutely right in terms of it would be true in public schools as well as in independent schools. If there was a specific discipline that is just harder to fill for a variety of reasons, often the sciences come in as one area, native speaker in a particular language that is offered by the school. I mean, there's lots of reasons. I have seen lots of creativity at the independent school level. And I've also, I also know it changes the difference between a day independent school and a boarding independent school. Can find all sorts of ways to meet the needs that they have and to also support a candidate. I think that's part of the conversation that you need to have during your process, and just determine what makes most sense for you. I also want to say that when we talk about independent schools, I don't want you all to be limited to just the United States. There are independent schools all over the world who are offering exceptional teaching and learning opportunities for students and for educators. Many are teaching an IB curriculum, which is the International Baccalaureate, which is meant to be transferable to any IB school. There are many schools that are teaching in English primarily. And I attended one of those schools in Dominican Republic, as I mentioned, earlier. And I experienced just an exceptional opportunity to really learn in my parents' home country, which helped me understand a great deal about my own life and upbringing. And I also was really grateful that the teachers that I met there, some of which I am still in touch with many, many years later, really had a profound impact on me. And I credit them and the coaches that I had with what ultimately became the reason why I ended up in independent schools and chose this as a career. Because remember, I wasn't planning on it. I was supposed to go to law school. So something to think about, where there's, an interest and a will, explore the conversations and see how it might be possible.
Thanks, Liz. I want to ask our panelists to weigh in with one final round. We want to end promptly at 5:30 or maybe a minute after, because we want to respect your time and respect our panelists' time. But one thing you want to share with the audience, maybe repeat something, emphasize something you said already or a colleague said, or something you didn't get to say that you want to add. And I'll let you volunteer so that I don't call on anyone out of turn.
I'll jump in because I see my battery is very close to ending. And I'm like, let me not get cut off. So I'd like to say that teaching for me is something that we learn by doing. Right. So I did go to school to study to teach, but I've really learned how to teach from teaching. And so I want to echo what people said before about getting experience doing it in your university. But there's lots of different types of teaching and different ways to teach. So and you can learn if you're teaching a cooking class, if you're coaching a sport, like there are transferable skills again. And I also want to plug my book again. It's not mine, but I really think it's great. So Dr. Bettina Love's book. And then, when you click this one, and I would recommend, I'll put the link in the chat. Then there's also related folks who like this title, also like this title, but start to read the language of the field. And I think this also speaks to the wider impact. We're not just doing it just because, for our own thought, but to make an impact on the world around us. And I think this is a wonderful way to do it. And I think she really makes that case.
I'll just jump in to say that, yes, thank you for the book recommendations. And also to that point about making an impact and following and continue, and others have talked about continued learning. Something that I haven't mentioned so far is that there's often opportunities to design electives, at least in the independent school world. And for instance, my research before I left academia was increasingly going toward environmental humanities and work on the climate crisis. And to get to teach a course, for instance, on environmental justice that I designed and go in the summer for a week-long, professional development workshops paid for by my school, and to continue, or do apply for NEH seminars for high school teachers and be supported in lots of different ways by scholarly organizations, even while a teacher. There's just so much. There's so many opportunities to connect with both the subjects you care about and then the students that you teach. So to try to make an impact, not just on them, but help them make an impact on the world, and engage with real life issues that are unfolding. So lots of opportunities to continue thinking in new ways and develop courses as you go.
If I could jump in. So my final word is just, I'm having more fun in the classroom than I've ever had. I say this, I have joy in the classroom. I really love teaching here. I've never had so much fun teaching. I really, really mean that. It's a lot of work, and it's every day, and the rhythm can be a little bit more intense, but it is so much fun.
I guess I'll jump in here too. I echo everything that everyone has said, particularly the idea of having an impact on students. Sometimes the impact can be really, really surprising. Sometimes you don't even know the impact you're making. And the relationship that I have with my students at the K through 12 level, or say the 9 through 12 level, it is kind of closer and long lasting in ways that my contact with my university students was not. And there's a well-honed tradition of kids coming back, and because they want to tell you, so you send them off to university, and they come back and they tell you there's a sort of personal relationship that you build in the 3 or 4 years that you have students in class. That is still there, and they'll come back, and I get postcards from students around the world, and I even get accosted in the parking lot by students that I had 10, 15, 20 years ago, who sometimes just want to tell you that they've become a teacher, or that it can be extremely fulfilling, both in the classroom when you're having fun with the kids, but later on down the road, sometimes you have no idea the mark that you're making. It sounds really cheesy, but I really do believe that that's true.
I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to share, to expose you all to the NYSE's job fair to promote diversity. I also have included some information in the chat. We do offer free webinars. They're a maximum of 60 minutes. And we have highlighted different topics, some of which you explored today: transitioning from public, parochial, charter schools and higher ed, career transitions, what's it like to be a person of color in an independent school at this moment, what's the virtual hiring process, what should I think about in terms of the virtual demos, et cetera, what should I expect? All of those are available. I've posted all the information, and I want to leave you with this. Looking for a job is a job in itself. And it's an investment of time. There's lots of ways that you can choose to spend your time, because it's the one thing we can't renew. We can't end up with more time. I'm going to encourage you all to seriously think about the opportunity to attend the NYSE's job fair. There's going to be over 100 schools throughout the Northeast that will be present. It is a virtual event, so you get to do it from your own your own home or wherever you choose to be. My email address was also posted, and I welcome the opportunity to speak with you, not just about the NYSE's job fair, about independent schools in general. I'm eager to support you in any way possible. It is part of the reason why for 22 years I have been really passionate about the craft of teaching and the experience of guiding young people through the learning process so that they truly can be the kinds of citizens and leaders for good in the world. And that's really just so important to me. And from what I heard from all of our colleagues today, it's clear that it's as important to them as well. So I wish you all the very best of luck and the opportunity to serve and support you in your process at any moment. And those webinars that I mentioned, you can watch at your own time. Some are live and then they're recorded. So there's an opportunity for you to watch them all in advance of the job fair, which is on Saturday, February 26th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So best of luck, stay healthy and hopeful, everyone. Joy, back to you.
Liz, thank you so much, and really helpful and inspiring, all of you. Thank you. I'm sorry that that Tinia's battery clearly gave out on her. She gave us a warning that happened, but I thank her across the ether. And Susan, Juan Carlos, Katie, thank you so much. Oh, there you are again. And Tinia, thank you so much. We're glad you reconnected for the final thanks. Thank you to our audience. We appreciate your feedback. You can always contact us at acls.org at our website. There's a contact information at the very bottom. We love hearing what worked, what didn't. We want these events to work for you. And let me just say, I feel immensely invigorated, not only by the amazing presentations and comments by all the panelists, but by just the ideas that they're engaging with, that they're presenting for us, and the conviction that they're sharing about the impact of teaching at all levels, and the humanistic wisdom that they're bringing to the world. It makes me feel better about the world at a moment that, that's full of uncertainties. So I hope that's shared with all of you in our audience. Again, a heartfelt thank you to our panelists. We so appreciate your time at this busy season. Best wishes to all. Stay healthy and stay in touch with us. Thank you. Good night.